Well, welcome everybody. This is RTBLive, and my name is Ken Samples. I'm part of the scholar team at Reasons to Believe, and I'm very happy and excited to be with you today. It's a pleasure to be able to give a presentation and then have some time to field your questions in the area of Christian theology, philosophy, apologetics, and maybe even a little science. And so I'm looking forward to today's message very much. I am, of course, like you, quarantined, but I jokingly like to say, as a bookish introvert who reads 3 hours a day, I didn't even know there was a quarantine. That's my typical approach to things. I'm doing well. I've been reading a lot. Some of the books I've been reading in my time of being home. I am very much a promoter of what I call lifelong learning. And one of the books that I try to make my way through every year is the Dictionary of Cultural Literacy. The lead editor of that book is the famous educator E.D. Hirsch. That's a book that really is helpful in terms of kind of learning all kinds of ideas. I've also been reading a little bit of philosophy. A philosopher named Steve Evans came out with a book a few years ago entitled A History of Western Philosophy, and I'm slowly making my way through that. I am also reading a book on creeds. I love the Christian creeds: the Apostles' Creed, Athanasian Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Creed of Chalcedon. This book that I'm reading is by Luke Timothy Johnson, entitled The Creed, and I highly recommend that book. To tell you a little bit about some other things that I've been up to during the quarantine, I was able to finish a new book manuscript. I don't know if it will retain this title or not, but it is tentatively titled Objections Overruled: Answering a Dozen Challenges to Historic Christianity. And in that book, I look at two types of challenges. Is Christianity rational, and is Christianity good? I've noted on my podcast, Straight Thinking, that when I used to go to the university, when I first started out doing apologetics professionally, in those days I worked at the Christian Research Institute with Walter Martin, who was the original Bible Answer Man. And when Walter passed away, from time to time I would be one of the people there doing the Bible Answer Man and answering questions, which is a lot like what we'll be doing today. But in those days, 33 years ago or so, when I would go to the university, people would ask truth questions. Students, faculty, they would ask me, does God exist? Is Christianity true? Did Jesus rise from the dead? I've noticed about 10 years ago, the questions now when I go to the university have changed somewhat. They still ask me truth questions. People still ask me about Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection. But a lot of times they ask me whether Christianity is good. They'll ask me, for example, what is Christianity's relationship to slavery? Or they'll ask me challenging biblical questions like, what about the genocide, alleged genocide of the Canaanites in the Old Testament? Or they'll ask me about, people who have been killed in the name of God. So people have lots of questions now about whether Christianity is really a good religion. So what I've done in this new book is try to approach a discussion of the historic Christian faith from both of those angles. First, looking at truth questions, and then looking at questions of Christianity's, whether it is a good faith, whether it's been good for the world. I also wanted to tell you a little story. I have been trying to do some hiking in the local hills where I live, get a little exercise, get my heart pumping a little bit more. And yesterday I was hiking up a trail, and a snake came right in front of me. It was about 20 feet in front of me, but it got my attention. It's kind of interesting. I hike up in this canyon, and of course, it's very rural, lots of bushes and rocks. And I know intellectually there are a lot of snakes up there, but I'd never seen a snake. And it's kind of interesting when I knew there are snakes up there, but when one pops out and introduces himself, so to speak, now I really know there are snakes. In fact, it was about 7 feet long, if I estimate it right, had a black head and a red body. And so I went on the web and tried to discover what kind of breed it was. And I'm not sure I know, but I told my wife about this, and I said, that snake cut me off. And my wife said, well, that's the snake's domain. You're merely a tourist. So I had a little snake encounter, but I was not harmed, and I don't think that the snake was venomous. There are some rattlesnakes up there in that particular area. Well, that's a little bit about me, what I've been doing. And again, I am glad to be with you today. All of the scholars at Reasons to Believe are really enjoying doing these RTBLive events. Just a little foretaste, next week, Hugh Ross will be back with you. He has a presentation entitled A Galaxy Like No Other. So you definitely want to come back for Hugh Ross, who is my colleague and my friend and my boss. So you want to come back next time. I'm going to give a presentation, and I want to tell you that you can download the slides. I would encourage you to do so. You can go to reasons.org/Ken, and that will be made available to you. So let me move over here to my particular slides. And the talk I want to give today is entitled, Can a Compulsive Thinker Also Be a Christian Thinker? Now, what I am getting at in that title is, a lot of people think that being a Christian is incompatible with being a deep thinker. Now, I don't think that's the case. And in fact, I think if you look carefully at Christian history, you will see that some of the greatest scientists, some of the greatest philosophers, some of the greatest logicians, etc., have clearly been both Christians and have been deeply committed thinkers. But there are people in the church from time to time who see kind of a tension between being a thinker and being a person of faith. And of course, being on social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc., there are plenty of times when I encounter non-Christians, often of the atheist or skeptical variety, and they tend to think that there is a real difference between being a thinker on one hand and being a person of faith who is committed to historic Christianity and to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. So what I'd like to do in our time together is really to talk a little bit about my own personal journey as both a thinker and as a Christian. You might call this a little autobiographical apologetics, if you will. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own journey, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think there is a very powerful way of defending the faith. Well, I think it's fair to say in describing myself that I think if I went to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they might think that I am an obsessive compulsive thinker. I think that's probably the case, but it is very much in a philosophical context. To be candid with you, I find it hard not to think about philosophical and religious questions. I sometimes joke with my wife that, maybe I should have become a banker and my 401k would be a lot higher than it is right now. Of course, I don't know if anybody's 401k is very high right now, given all of the issues relating to the economy and the pandemic that we're in. But my wife's response, of course, whenever I say things like that is she'll say, yeah, You might have been a banker or a lawyer, but in your spare time, you would be reading philosophy. And I think that's right. I cannot not think about philosophical questions. I cannot not philosophize. So the questions of God, the questions of meaning to life are very, very meaningful to me. Um, and when I was growing up, I wanted to be a professional baseball player. I didn't let school kind of get in the way. I wasn't very studious. In fact, most people who know me as an adult might be surprised that I was not very much a committed student or a deep reader. But when I became a Christian, all of that changed. I realized immediately when I became a Christian that my mind mattered and that truth mattered. And, Jehovah's Witnesses would knock at my door. And I noticed very quickly that their view of Jesus was very different than my view of Jesus. And when I would go to school and study philosophy, I realized that not everybody shared my particular perspective. But when I was growing up, I had a sense of longing and a sense of restlessness. Of course, I thought maybe if I became a famous professional baseball player, that dissatisfaction, that restlessness might go away. I thought maybe if I met the right young woman, that my life would feel a lot more fulfilled. Um, and yet I still knew I was searching. I listened to the Beatles when I was growing up and followed the Lakers and the Dodgers. That was kind of my trinity in those years. I was a passionate sports fan, a Los Angeles sports fan. And I liked popular music, and the Beatles were enormously popular when I was growing up. So I knew I was searching for something, but I didn't know what it was. And as I have shared many times when I kind of talk about my own life, I had an older brother who died prematurely. He was a great, great young man. But he became addicted to some serious drugs and had some psychological problems and had a tough time. And he died at 27 years old. And that really kind of returned me to the big questions. I began asking, who am I? Why am I here? Does God exist? Where is my brother? Did he survive the death of his body? And what is the meaning of my life? And will I survive the death of my body? And I was about 20 years old. I think 19 when my brother died. 20 when I became a Christian. My older sister had become a Christian. I grew up kind of a nominal Catholic. I had a lot of respect for the Catholic Church, and I had a lot of respect for Jesus, but I didn't particularly understand Catholicism or really Christianity overall. And I wasn't deeply committed to a kind of a Catholic or Christian lifestyle. So my sister gave me a book by C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. And I didn't read it right away, but I began reading it. And that book played a very important role in me coming to faith. I remember other things, kind of other factors were important in that. But I want to also tell you that I hold a theological view. I'm kind of a Augustinian. That's tied back to St. Augustine, whose dates are 354 to 430 AD. Augustine's had a big influence on both Catholics and Protestants. And I believe that God has to do something in your heart in order for you to really move in his direction. And he did something in my heart. And I think all of that longing and that restlessness was a sign that all of us have. In fact, if you look at history, people tend to be pilgrim seekers. They tend to be people who are looking for ultimate answers. Here's a little quote from St. Augustine. This comes from his book, The Confessions. And if you've never read Augustine, that would be a good place, maybe if you'd like to read him to start. It's his autobiography. It talks about his spiritual journey. And by the way, when Augustine wrote that book, there was no genre of literature called the autobiography. He invented it. And by the way, Augustine is also probably, maybe even more probably, uh, he is the most prolific author in the ancient world. Either of Greek or Latin writers, wrote more than 5 million words. But here's what he says in the Confession. He says, in a prayer to God, man is one of your creatures, Lord, and his instinct is to praise you. The thought of you stirs him so deeply that he cannot be content unless he praises you, because you made us for yourself, and our hearts find no peace until they rest in you. This is an idea that runs deep among Christian thinkers, that we're made for God, that our ultimate fulfillment and satisfaction is to be found in God. And if we seek purpose and meaning and significance in other areas, it will be inadequate. It will never ultimately fulfill us. And of course, another Christian that I came to study and admire and greatly respect was C.S. Lewis. Lewis developed in his book, Mere Christianity, he talked about what has come to be known as the argument from desire. That is, that God put desires in our hearts, and those desires are for Him. We belong to Him, we're made for Him, and you can try to fill your life with money and with pleasure and fame and drugs, whatever it is, but it won't ultimately work. And here is C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. He says, quote, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Well, this idea, again, we see it in Augustine, we see it in C.S. Lewis. Here is a quote from Pascal. Blaise Pascal was a very important scientist at the time of the scientific revolution. This is kind of the middle of the 1600s when modern science came to be. It happened in Europe within a Christian context, and the Christian worldview played a significant role in the emergence of science, in getting science rolling. Pascal was a physicist, he was a mathematician, he was a logician, grew up nominal Catholic, had a very strong conversion or drawn back to historic Christianity when he was a young man. But he says in his book, The Pensées, which is French, Pascal was a Frenchman. Pensées is French for thoughts or reflections. And Pascal says this. He says, not only do we only know God through Jesus Christ, but we only know ourselves through Jesus Christ. We only know life and death through Jesus Christ. Apart from Jesus Christ, we cannot know the meaning of our life or our death, of God or of ourselves. And so this idea is a very powerful one. And we see it in Augustine, we see it in Pascal, we see it in C.S. Lewis, and that is that we're made for God. And the problem is, however, the fall. Adam and Eve rebelled against God, and their nature has been passed on to us, and therefore we have been cut off from God, and yet we still want God. We still need God, even if we're not aware of that. And oftentimes we try to find other means of finding fulfillment. I recently watched a film about the life of the very famous rock and roll singer and performer Elton John. When I was in middle school, we called it junior high school in those days, and high school, Elton John was enormously popular. Songs like Rocket Man and Benny and the Jets were right at the top of the charts. But what's interesting is Elton lived a very tortured life. And you can almost bring anybody into that. My favorite sports heroes, Ted Williams, the great baseball player. I think he was the greatest hitter of all time. Or Jerry West, the great star guard for the Los Angeles Lakers. Both Ted Williams and Jerry West were enormously talented. I could only hope to play the way they routinely performed on the field and on the court. But as I've read about the life of Ted Williams and the life of Jerry West, they lived very tortured lives. Fame, money, uh, all of that wasn't enough for them. And so this idea that we're made for God and that we have desires, we're searchers, we're on a pilgrim quest. I love what Pascal says, because when you discover Jesus, or when Jesus discovers you, you actually begin to understand who you are. So what I have found is that lots of evangelical Christians, they like apologetics, but I'd like to encourage you to consider reading some of the Christian classical books. And that is people like St. Augustine and his Confessions. You can pick it up. It's a pretty readable book. I mean, for a man who wrote in the ancient world, Augustine writes quite a bit like contemporary people. There are some good translations available. I like the Penguin Classic edition. You can also get Blaise Pascal's Pensées. It's a remarkable book written by a remarkable thinker. Now, all of these people that I've talked about, these big three right now, I mentioned Augustine, I mentioned Pascal, and I mentioned C.S. Lewis. Well, all three of these individuals are both thinkers as well as committed Christians. In fact, these are three intellectual giants, if you will. It's hard to imagine a more influential Christian thinker outside of the biblical authors than St. Augustine. He's not nearly as influential in Eastern Christendom among Eastern Orthodox, but among Catholics and Protestants, Augustine is very, very influential. Pascal, another individual, he was Catholic and a great scientist, but also a committed Christian apologist. And of course, C.S. Lewis, who spent part of his life as an atheist, had a dramatic conversion to Christianity. And Lewis was a leading intellectual at Oxford University. In fact, Lewis said, and I believe it, even though I envy it, Lewis said he thought he could remember everything he had ever read in his life. In fact, he used to play a game with his students at Oxford. He would allow the students to go into his library and they would pick out a book. He didn't know what book it was and read a section from it. And Lewis would tell them what book it was, and he would provide the context for the quote. And so what I want to underscore at this point is, again, just a couple things. Thinking and faith can go together. And historically, they have. Some of the greatest thinkers have also been believers. They have been historic Christians. And it is very common for people to be searching in life. And the Christian message is that all of us are, to some degree, restless. Some of us, it's a little more out in front than others. I definitely was looking for answers and going to parties with my friends as a young guy and, trying to find myself. It really didn't work. But this idea is that God has put in our heart an awareness of who he is. And when we discover him, when his grace allows us to discover him, we're in a position where our life can really, really begin. Well, in light of that little foundation, I want to talk a little bit about some specific areas of Christian apologetics. And I want to talk a little bit about worldview and then a little bit about an approach to apologetics that I appreciate and I think is very useful. One thing I want to say um, right here is that it's really important to think about worldviews. I think everybody should give thought to the concept of worldview. A worldview is how we view the world. It's our big picture view of reality. It consists of a cluster of beliefs about the most important beliefs: your view of God, your view of the world, your view of knowledge, your view of morality, aesthetics, how you make sense of the world. Could think about it like the lenses on a pair of glasses. The lenses either bring you uh, close in connection with reality, or possibly they may distort reality. But I think that there are four major worldview perspectives. Christianity is a very strong and robust worldview, particularly in the West, but not exclusively. It's thought that there may be 2.2 to 2.3 billion Christians in the world. Of course, I'm being inclusive there. I'm including Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, all of the branches of Christendom. Islam, even though it is monotheistic and it is Middle Eastern and it has connections to both Judaism and Christianity, Islamic scholars not only see their religion as their own culture and their own religion, they see it as their own worldview. Now, again, it's theistic in orientation, like Judaism and Christianity. But, you know, there are about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. And the Pew report, they said by the year 2050, there'll be 9 billion people on planet Earth, and 3 billion will be Christian, 3 billion will be Muslim, and there will be 3 billion other people with a combination of beliefs, both religious and secular. And of course, the idea from the Pew report is based on the trends. Islam grows a great deal because they have lots of children. Religious people tend to have more children than secular people. And so, can you imagine 9 billion people on the planet, 3 billion Christian, 3 billion Muslim, 3 billion others, who include both secularists as well as people who embrace other religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, etc. A third worldview, and I'm going to kind of put it in the category here of kind of Eastern mysticism. I'm going to talk about Hindus and Taoists and people who hold an Eastern mystical view. I would kind of put Buddhism in there as well. I'm kind of truncating it, no disrespect intended, but that would be another 1.5 billion people. And then finally, a fourth worldview would be naturalism. That would be a worldview that advocates that the natural, material, physical universe is the sole reality. There's no spiritual, there's no God, there's no soul. This would reflect atheism. And so you have those kind of four worldviews, if you will. And what I want to say about those is, Christian theism says there is a tripersonal God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is both the creator and the redeemer. But Islamic theism sees God as personal, but he's one God, one person. Muslims reject the Trinity, but they don't view, that is, Muslims don't view Allah as being a savior. He's your judge. And so paradise or damnation are earned rewards. Islamic theism is not a redemptive religion. In fact, the word father is never mentioned in the Quran. Of course, pantheism would say, and I'm kind of using that as that Eastern category, the Eastern religions. Pantheism would say all is God and God is all. And then finally, naturalism would say that nature, the material physical world, is all there is. There is no life after death. There is no spiritual God. There's no soul. But of course, all of these viewpoints can't be true at the same time and in the same respect. That's where we get down to logic. Logic would tell us that since these views logically conflict, they contradict one another. They can't all be true. And that's where I would simply say maybe there is a powerful way of looking at this. And that's where I just briefly want to conclude my talk by talking about abductive reasoning. Some of you who've done a little study in logic, you might be familiar with deductive reasoning, where the goal of your argument is to derive a certainly true conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, if all men are mortal and Socrates is one of those men who is mortal, then it follows with certainty that he's mortal. Or you may have heard inductive reasoning, where you seek to derive a probably true conclusion. And induction has a strong influence in the scientific enterprise. But abduction deals with plausibility. It can't give you certainty, but it's different than induction in that it doesn't seek to predict. Scientists use induction in their hypothesis to attempt to predict and then test things. Abduction deals with plausibility. What is plausible? And if I could simply bring us back to a couple ideas that we've been talking about, abductive reasoning would say something like this. It would say, it seems like human beings are restless. It seems that it's a common characteristic of the human condition to be looking and desiring ultimate purpose for one's life. People tend to be purpose-seeking creatures. They seem to be looking for ultimate meaning and purpose and significance. To use the words of St. Augustine, people are looking for rest and peace. They're looking for satisfaction in life. Well, an abductive type of reasoning would say, hey, look, this seems to be a general experience of human beings. I mean, are there people out there who are not looking for ultimate answers? Well, maybe there are. But my reflections on the human condition, my reading, my thinking, my own experience, the people I know, seems to indicate that looking for answers to life's big questions seems to be a human issue. It seems to be something human beings really deeply care about. Well, an abductive approach to reasoning could look at it this way. They would say, for example, that it seems that looking for deep answers to questions is the universal human condition. But if Christianity is true, that is that God created human beings, they rebelled against human beings, people are fallen, you would expect, if Christianity is indeed true, you would expect to see people looking, seeking, and you would also expect that they would be frustrated in anything other than God. And so this is a type of abductive type of reasoning where you're saying, we see this phenomena of human beings being searchers on a pilgrim quest. But if the Christian faith is true, given its view of creation and anthropology, the fallenness of the human condition, then this would be something you should expect if Christianity is true. And so if I could bring this brief little discussion to a close, what I like about abductive reasoning is that it attempts to try to show what is the best explanation. And one of the reasons that I think Christianity is indeed true is that I think that it does a really good job in explaining the world. And by the way, I should tell you that lots of people use abductive reasoning. Detectives do it, historians, scientists, physicians, mechanics. Whenever I go to the doctor and the doctor works through his diagnosis, anybody who is a diagnostician is involved in abductive reasoning. And physicians do it when they look at your symptoms and, they try to come up with an explanation as to what's wrong with you. but detectives do it. My friend J. Warner Wallace, who is a cold case detective, he talks about this kind of thing. And even my dad. My dad was a World War II veteran. After the war, he became a automobile and truck mechanic. And I remember the old days when I was a boy. My dad would, to help the neighbors, particularly women in the church who were widows. My dad would tune up their cars for them. He figured, well, their husband is gone, they need help, and my dad was a really good mechanic. In fact, he was in the place that he worked. Whenever they had a difficult time with an engine, they would bring him in. He was a person who would give a diagnosis of a particular engine. But I remember being a boy, and my dad would open the hood of a car and just listen to the engine, and then he would tell them what was wrong. And I thought, my dad's a shaman. This is almost supernatural. Well, my dad wasn't a shaman, and it wasn't supernatural. My dad was involved in abductive reasoning. He knew enough about the internal combustion engine to know that carburetor problems or transmission problems gave up symptoms. And he was involved in it as a diagnostician. And I think if we diagnose the human condition, we discover that Christianity's explanation of the world and of us fits pretty well. And so if you would like to go to the slides, and they are available, you can download them, reasons.org/Ken. I have an extended discussion, lots of notes here that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but it will kind of whet your appetite, if you will. And so I'm going to stop there. I hope you enjoyed that introduction to a little of my own autobiographical experience, also touching upon the argument from desire and looking at abductive reasoning. And I simply want to make the statement that I'm a compulsive thinker, and I know a lot of people who are compulsive type thinkers. And there have been many people in history, like some of the individuals I've mentioned, and they never thought that being a thinker and being a person of faith was at odds. In historic Christianity, God has given us our minds. And Jesus tells us that we should love God with our entire being, with our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And so Christians should use their mind to love God. And hopefully that will communicate to non-Christians that we are not just feelers. Don't get me wrong. I don't like people who are just cold analytical thinkers. I like warm people. I like loving people. If I die and the people closest to me say, yeah, Ken read a lot of books and he was a good thinker, but he wasn't loving, he wasn't kind, he wasn't gracious, then I think I would have failed. I want to love God with my mind, but I also want to love him with my heart. And so I think that there is a powerful place for thinkers, compulsive thinkers, and you might be one of them. You might be a believer, you might be a Christian, you may not be, but I think that historic Christianity has a long case for having thinkers as well as people who are warm, committed in their faith. Well, again, I'm going to stop there. I hope that this was meaningful to you. I look forward to interacting in just a minute or so here with your questions, and you can ask questions and you can download my slides. And so I'm going to take a look here and see what kind of questions are available to me. Let's see here. Let me start with a question from Chong. In response to C.S. Lewis, I want to go back I went to go back history to change my mistakes in the past, but in spite of my desire, there is no time travel. In psychology, we can call it wishful thinking. What are your thoughts on this idea? Well, let me see if I understand the question. So you're responding to Lewis, and I want to go back into history, change my mistakes of the past, but in spite of my desire, there is no time travel. In psychology, we call it wishful thinking. Okay, I think I'm tracking with you now. I think that I don't think that this is wishful thinking. Um, that is, I think that this is a universal type of phenomenon. I don't think that. Uh, let me approach it from somewhat of a different angle. I think that uh, believing that something is going on in our lives by our questing, our looking, our desiring, I think something is going on. And I think if we look at it from an abductive point of view, and again, abduction would say we see this universal, this seemingly universal phenomenon of people searching for answers. But if Christianity is true, that is what we would expect. People are made in the image of God. People have been cut off from God because of the fall. There will be people who will be seeking to satisfy their inner desires, but they'll never be able to do it. They'll always be dissatisfied. So I think we can move out of the realm of wishful thinking by placing it within the context of testing it. And you know, if Christianity does a good job of explaining the human condition, then I think that's a good reason to believe that Christianity reflects truth about reality. So I don't think that this is, I don't think we can just chalk this up merely to wishful thinking. I think there's too much explanatory power going on here. And of course, if you don't like this argument that I've presented, there are plenty of other arguments. I mean, we can introduce all kinds of other arguments, probability-based arguments, deductive arguments. I mean, if you're not impressed by this appeal to desire, that's just one argument among many others. Okay, question from Paul. I want to worship God in spirit and in truth, but find it hard to do so in contemporary evangelical church services, which tend to be more emotional. How do you balance emotions and logic to worship God more fully? Well, Paul, thank you for that really important question. I'm glad you asked the question, and I know for me, I'm going to give you my own perspective. I I really like a liturgical worship. Now that's not for everybody. You know, some people really enjoy going to kind of a contemporary worship where there is popular singing, less hymns, more contemporary type of worship. But some of us are, we really like a liturgy. I certainly do. I like to I like to hear prayers. I like to participate in prayers that involve the Trinity, that teach me historic Christianity. So I attend a church where we have a more liturgical worship. We utilize the Book of Common Prayer. There is public reading of Scripture. But understand that, Christians are in different places in their life. There are some Christians who kind of grew up looking for more of a formal worship. There are others who like more contemporary worship. Christianity has many different types of churches. But Paul, if you are one of those who would maybe like to have more tradition, if you'd like more time of reflection, then I think you might want to take a look at maybe an Anglican form of worship or the more traditional forms of worship. I touch upon this a little bit in my up and coming book, where I talk about Christendom and is it divided and things of that nature. But yeah, I think you might enjoy the more traditional type of worship. I think it might offer you some things that you've been looking for. But I also want you to recognize that Christians come at these things very differently. Let's see, here's a question from Dylan. I think Dylan is a Facebook friend of mine. How would you recommend Christians engage in promoting truth during this pandemic? Head knowledge and connect it to existential heart questions that point people to God. How can Christians charitably and publicly correct their own misunderstandings in the confusion and chaos of this pandemic? Well, thank you, Dylan. I will tell you, in light of my own interaction on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, even on the web. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there wasn't an internet. I remember the first email I sent way back when. I think it's really important if you want to communicate Christianity. That is, if you want to engage in evangelism, if you want to engage in defending the faith, what we call apologetics. I think you have to think about two things, and you've touched on them. I'm going to use the metaphor of the head and the heart. I think you want to be careful and thoughtful and reflective in the ideas that you present to other people. You want to be intellectually careful. But I also think that you want to be a person of the heart. And I think when it comes to convincing, somebody might be impressed with your logical argument, but if they think you're a jerk, if they think you're not a person they would like to be like, Jesus was motivated, I think, as I read the Gospels, it seems Jesus was motivated by two things. He was driven by two things. He was driven by truth and by love. And, so you might give somebody a really good answer, but if they don't think that you're kind and you're gracious, it's not going to ever be as persuasive. And of course, we see this in the New Testament. The Apostle Peter, in the second epistle, tells us, always be ready to give to every man an answer. Well, that takes some head knowledge. That takes the head. But Peter says, do it with gentleness, keeping a good conscience, being gracious. I think that's just absolutely necessary. And I think you can think of some creative ways. People are stuck at home right now. They probably have more time to think about issues. I think you can raise good arguments and do it in a winsome way. Those are very powerful forms of persuasion. Logos, ethos, pathos, what Aristotle called the classical forms of persuasion. I think those are very much useful to today's Christian. Let's see here. Question, can an obsessive compulsive person who struggles against his or her addictions be a true Christian? Well, I really appreciate you asking that question. That's a very important question. And the answer to your question is yes. Lots of us are obsessive compulsive, and lots of us have addictions. Christians are not immune to the difficulties of life. Christians can have mental health challenges. Christians can become addicted to eating too much. I have struggled with my weight through much of my adult life. Christians can become addicted to drinking too much. People can self-medicate. And of course, on an online era, people can have even something like a sexual addiction. Does God know that we struggle in life? He does. God doesn't save perfect people. He saves people who are broken and who are fallen. And so we're saved by grace through faith in Christ, not by our works. Now, that doesn't give us an excuse. If you are hooked on pornography, or if you are hooked on other areas of addiction, you need some help. You need some accountability. You need to talk with a pastor, a counselor. You need to talk with other Christians, have time of prayer. But being an imperfect person and struggling with addictions does not disqualify you as a Christian. There are Christians, again, who struggle with all kinds of things, mental health challenges. I have people in my family who struggle with these things. In fact, there have been times in my own life where I've struggled with depression. So I've got good news for you. God saves imperfect people, and that means you and me. And so I want to encourage you to talk to some people that can help you if you're struggling in those areas. There's some really excellent centers of counseling. There are good pastors that can help, and there are some really good books and things that can help you. Okay, let's see. This is a question from Jessica. Any book recommendations for better understanding Buddhism and Hinduism? Well, that's such a wonderful question, and I have a book for you. In 2017, I wrote a book entitled God Among Sages. And in that book, I compare Jesus with Krishna, the central religious figure of Hinduism, and with Siddhartha Gautama, the leader of Buddhism. I also compare Jesus with Confucius in Confucianism, and with Muhammad, the prophet in the religion of Islam. I would strongly recommend, Jessica, that you consider giving that book a read. It is available on Amazon. It's also available at Reasons to Believe. We have a store. And the cool thing about our store is if you order a book through us and you request an autograph from Ken Samples, we'll move heaven and earth to make sure you get an autographed copy. But I like that book because I think it's fair. I really try to treat these other religions respectfully. I point out where I, as a Christian, disagree with them, but I work very hard to treat them in a fair-minded and a respectful way. And I hope you might pick that book up. Again, it's God Among Sages would be a good place for you to begin. Let's see here. A question from Doug. How effective are apologetics and evangelism? Does anyone reach saving grace through mental assertion? Well, Doug, thanks. It's a good question. It's a thoughtful question. I don't think that anyone ever comes to faith merely, purely, or solely from intellectual arguments. But nor do I think that a person comes to faith purely, solely from emotive or emotional elements. I think a person coming to faith is a dynamic event. I think it absolutely has to involve the grace of God, because we are saved by grace. We're called by grace. It is God doing something in our hearts and our minds. But I would say that grace could use reason and argumentation and logic as a means to God's ends. And so in my own life, I was struggling. I was struggling with the death of my brother. I was struggling with trying to figure out what my life was all about. And my sister gave me the book by C.S. Lewis. I think God used Lewis's arguments to move me to the Christian track. And so I absolutely think that people never come to faith in Christ purely or solely or exclusively based upon a logical or a argument from reason. But those may be the means to God's ends. And so grace can involve all of those things. our winsome character, our sense of charity, uh, reading scripture, all of those things are involved in evangelism. I'd like to encourage you to take a look at my books. One of them is Without a Doubt, where I answer the 20 toughest faith questions, and also in my book, 7 Truths That Changed the World. I talk about God's grace. I talk about salvation, how God works through his Spirit to draw us to him, but how he uses apologetic arguments. Let's see, question, is intentionally looking for what you would expect in a result a justifiable way to approach the search for knowledge? Well, let me put it to you this way. I think that I think there are times where deduction and induction are not necessarily the best fit. I mean, if we look back at Jesus and we say, well, who was Jesus? Was he, was he a menace? Was he a maniac? Was he a Martian? Was he Messiah? What is the best explanation of Jesus? That involves this testing of possible explanations. But it's not exclusive to that. I mean, even when we look at where human beings come from, were they created by God? Did they evolve naturalistically? A lot of times it involves looking at what is the best explanation. And in an abductive form of reasoning, we look at the human condition, or we look at the information we have about Jesus, or we look at the scientific data about humanity. And one way of looking at that is to say, hey, this seems to have a lot of explanatory power. This seems to explain. I mean, one of the reasons I think Christianity is true is it explains so many things so very well. It explains why there's a universe, why the universe is fine-tuned, why it's designed, why it's intelligible. The Judeo-Christian worldview, the Bible explains the human condition, why people have intellectual and rational abilities, but why all of us are fallen, why all of us are looking for moral and aesthetic needs in our life, why logic and mathematics work. I think that abductive reasoning is a very powerful way. I'm not saying that it's the only way of reasoning, and I'm not saying it's the only way of approaching truth. If you'd like to look at some of the more traditional arguments for God's existence, I think they're pretty strong. I also think that there are ways of looking at probability arguments. I'm just presenting this as one viable way of thinking. And I think cumulative case is very powerful. But by the way, remember what I said. Doctors reason this way. Scientists reason abductively. Mechanics do it. Lawyers do it. Policemen do it. In fact, I think abductive reasoning is the most natural way that people reason. I mean, let's suppose you're sleeping in on a Saturday morning, and maybe you're like me. Have you ever had that time when you're sleeping and you're not quite fully awake, but you're not totally asleep? You're kind of in this kind of gray area, and so you flip up the blind and you notice that the streets out in front of your house, they're wet. You search your mind immediately for an explanation. And for most of us, we draw the conclusion that it must have rained. Of course, in my neighborhood on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, the street sweeper comes by. But I think people are looking for explanations. When I walk into my doctor's office, he's going to look at my medical background. He's going to talk to me about my symptoms, and he is going to come up with a diagnostic explanation. And that's abductive reasoning. And when a policeman goes onto a crime scene, they look at the bullet wounds in the wall, they look at the blood, they come up with an explanatory theory. And scientists use abductive reasoning when they develop a hypothesis. Scientists use deduction, induction, and abduction. So I think abductive reasoning is something you want to look at very, very carefully. Let's see here. One more question. This is another Ken. I think this is also a Ken that I know from Facebook. Ken Kloss. How do we know that Christianity is a logical faith? I think it is, but don't know how to explain it to others. Well, I'm really glad you said that. You asked that question because in my previous RTBLive, I addressed the question of various ways in which I think Christianity is rational. For example, I mentioned that the Christian faith is compatible with the laws of logic and reason and rationality. I think Christianity does a good job of explaining the human condition. I would also tell you that faith, the word faith, pistuo is the verb, pistis is the noun, that the definition of faith involves a rational component. Traditionally, Christians have defined faith as confident trust in a reliable or credible source. So faith isn't just believing anything willy-nilly. Faith is putting your trust in something that's reliable or credible. And that's God, that's Christ, that's the evidence, that's the truth. And so faith involves reason and rationality. And I think if there is a God behind the universe who is infinitely wise and reasonable and rational, then I think that does a good job of explaining why human beings have rationality, why we can trust things like the laws of logic, mathematics, and principles of that nature. Can I do some of this in my book, Without a Doubt, and in my book, A World of Difference? I talk about those kinds of things. And in the new manuscript I have, I go a little bit further. Well, that was the last question. So I want to remind all of our viewers that if your question was not asked, or if it was not answered, rather, I want you to hang with us. We have what we call the RTB Live Extra, and we'll take some more of your questions. I also want to remind you that we'll have another RTB Live coming your way next week. Hugh Ross, who is the founder and president of Reasons to Believe. He is an astronomer by training, and he's going to be giving a presentation and fielding your questions. The presentation is entitled A Galaxy Like No Other, so you don't want to miss next time. I want to give you one more reminder that you can download the slides. Today I could only talk a little bit about the content that I have in the presentation. There's a lot more there if you'd like to explore it. And again, I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank you for being interested in Reasons to Believe, a Christian think tank, a Christian science faith, Christian apologetic organization. And I want to thank you for spending a bit of your afternoon with me. I pray that you are safe and well. I pray that soon the pandemic will pass. And I asked God's graciousness to guide you every day of your life as we move forward. So God bless you and stick with us. We're going to have, again, RTB Live Extra. Thank you, and good day to all of you. Bye-bye.